Welcome back to a mind-blowing dive into the hidden shadows of the massive music industry. We all know BTS as the untouchable kings of K-pop, breaking global records with absolute perfection and shining smiles. But what if that glittering surface is actually hiding a raging storm? Are they really as invincible as they seem? Or is the crushing pressure taking a dangerous toll? What unspoken limits are being severely pushed behind closed doors? Are the boys truly okay? Or are they silently screaming for a lifeline? Prepare to have your reality shifted and your heart race as we uncover the hidden truths. Buckle up, because here is BTS is not okay. 7 shocking facts that worry ARMY. Number 7. Jimin, the crushing weight of perfection. When the blinding stadium lights hit his face and the absolutely deafening roar of 60,000 screaming fans physically vibrates through the dense night air, Park Jimin is nothing short of a literal angel descending from the heavens, a mesmerizing, gravitational force of nature whose very existence seems specifically designed by the universe to captivate millions of hearts across the globe. Yet if we peel back the sparkling sequins and look beneath that ethereal grace and that flawlessly sculpted jawline, there lies a terrifyingly relentless pursuit of perfection that has historically pushed his physical body and his mental sanity to the absolute, terrifying brink of destruction. We all see the breathtaking pirouettes that defy gravity, the impossibly high vocal notes that send shivers down our spines, and the charming, devastating eye smiles that can instantly melt the coldest of hearts in a matter of seconds. But what the dazzling broadcast cameras, the glittering custom outfits, and the roaring, sold-out stadiums often completely fail to capture is the agonizing, gut-wrenching backstage reality of a deeply insecure man who constantly, obsessively feels like he is never, ever quite good enough. A devastatingly toxic mindset that has historically triggered massive, blaring alarm bells within the deeply observant and fiercely protective ARMY fandom. Let us rewind the clock for a second and take a hard look at the profoundly dark and grueling era of blood, sweat, and tears. A monumental, era-defining turning point in BTS's career that catapulted them into unprecedented, record-breaking global superstardom. But hidden behind the scenes of that majestic comeback, Jimin was silently waging a horrifying, life-threatening war against his own body through extreme, punishing diets that left everyone around him paralyzed with fear for his actual life. Driven by an overwhelming, agonizing desire to appear physically perfect for the fans and to fit an impossibly harsh industry standard that demands unearthly beauty, Jimin willingly subjected himself to a shockingly severe, almost torturous starvation regimen, surviving on virtually nothing, infamously restricting himself to just one agonizingly small meal every 10 days or surviving solely on tiny, miserable scraps of chicken breast, while simultaneously pushing through grueling, bone-crushing dance practices that lasted well into the dawn, punishing his body until his vision completely blurred. The room violently spun around him, and he physically collapsed from sheer, unadulterated exhaustion onto the freezing, cold practice room floor. It was a profoundly harrowing, heartbreaking period of time where his bandmates, especially Jeon, who is known for his nurturing, older brother instincts, watched in absolute, helpless horror, desperately pleading with him to just eat a proper meal, to take a desperately needed break, to show himself even a tiny fraction of the immense mercy and boundless love he so freely and generously gives to the rest of the world. But the terrifyingly strong, suffocating grip of deep-seated perfectionism had already taken firm root in his mind, making him completely and utterly deaf to their desperate cries and heartfelt warnings. And let's be entirely real here. The truly terrifying part of this entire situation is that this wasn't just a fleeting, one-time rookie phase that he eventually grew out of. It was a deeply ingrained, extremely dangerous psychological pattern that has continuously haunted his entire professional career, resurfacing time and time again with a vengeance whenever the immense pressure of a comeback mounts, transforming the massive, mirrored walls of the HYBE practice rooms into a cruel, unforgiving enemy that relentlessly magnifies every microscopic flaw and completely imaginary imperfection to a monstrous, unbearable scale. Even years later, during the intimate, supposedly glamorous filming of their various docu-series like Burn the Stage and behind-the-scenes concert footage, we have all collectively witnessed those deeply private, gut-wrenching, heart-shattering moments where Jimin completely breaks down in uncontrollable, agonizing tears, retreating to the darkest corners of the backstage area, entirely inconsolable and emotionally shattered, simply because his voice cracked slightly during a chaotic sound check, or because his microphone slipped by a millimeter, or he missed a single, microscopic micro-beat in a complex choreography that, to the untrained, admiring eyes of the audience, looked absolutely, undeniably flawless and utterly majestic. The crushing, suffocating weight of being universally labeled as the IT boy of South Korea, the lead vocalist who is heavily relied upon to carry the most difficult, throat-shredding high notes, and the main dancer of the biggest, most influential musical act on the entire planet, creates an incredibly toxic, high-pressure atmosphere where every single breath, every tiny movement, and every vocal inflection is intensely scrutinized by billions of critical eyes and ruthless internet trolls, leaving absolutely zero room for normal, natural human error. We seriously need to talk about the terrifying physical toll that is masterfully hidden beneath his glamorous, powerful stage presence. The painful, thick strips of kinesiology tape heavily strapped across his severely injured neck and back, the agonizing, freezing ice baths he regularly endures just to numb the searing, unbearable pain of severely overworked muscles that are screaming in agony, and the countless, heart-stopping times he has desperately, frantically gasped into pure oxygen. Masks in the dark backstage corridors just to stay conscious and upright between high-energy sets, all while a massive countdown timer forces him to run right back out there and perform. This intense physical deterioration and silent suffering is constantly, flawlessly masked by his blinding, angelic smiles the exact second the hydraulic lift raises him onto the stage, leaving us to deeply, philosophically question the heavy, invisible, and often deadly price tag of unprecedented global fame, and forcing us to wonder whether the sparkling, golden trophies, the historic, groundbreaking Grammy nominations, and the endlessly shattered Billboard records are truly, honestly worth the intense psychological torment and literal physical breakdown of a young man who is literally sacrificing his own well-being, drop by drop, on the unforgiving altar of global entertainment. When millions of armies frantically trended massive, desperate hashtags begging him to please prioritize his health, to sleep, to step back and just breathe, it wasn't just typical, overdramatic fan behavior. It was a genuine, desperate SOS sent out into the cold digital void. A massive collective cry of deep-seated worry from an incredibly observant fandom that could visibly, clearly see the dark, heavy exhaustion circles under his eyes, the dramatic, sudden fluctuations in his weight, and the silent, desperate cries for help meticulously hidden behind his incredibly brave, reassuring, but sometimes hauntingly hollow smiles. The sheer unfathomable level of self-sacrifice he constantly exhibits is absolutely mind-boggling, a painful, beautiful testament to his bottomless, unconditional love for his fans, but at the exact same time, it paints a terrifyingly bleak, dystopian picture of a cutthroat entertainment industry that brutally, unapologetically demands absolute, robotic perfection at the direct cost of basic human health and mental stability, leaving us to frantically wonder exactly how long a human being can Keep running at maximum speed on a completely empty tank before the engine completely, irrevocably, and tragically breaks down forever. During the remarkably raw, completely unfiltered vulnerability he bravely exposed in the creation of his incredibly successful solo debut album Face, Jimin literally locked himself away in a dimly lit, claustrophobic studio for months, actively and painfully battling severe emotional emptiness, bravely pouring his raw, crippling depression, his intense feelings of being completely lost, and his absolute darkest, most intrusive thoughts into incredibly heavy, aggressive tracks like Set Me Free PT2, shockingly confessing to the entire world that he had been entirely pretending to be okay. Number 6. RM, the crushing weight of the global crown. When you gaze upon Kim Namjoon, the towering, fiercely intellectual, and incredibly eloquent leader of the world's biggest musical phenomenon, you instantly see a seemingly unshakable pillar of absolute strength. A brilliant visionary who has confidently stood at the prestigious podium of the United Nations to deliver deeply moving, historic speeches, and a man who has flawlessly guided 6 other incredibly diverse personalities through the incredibly treacherous, shark-infested waters of the ruthless global music industry. Yet behind that brilliantly composed, deeply reassuring dimpled smile and that commanding, heavily authoritative baritone voice lies an agonizing, suffocating, and deeply terrifying psychological burden that has slowly, systematically eroded his own sense of personal identity to a terrifyingly fragile and vulnerable state. From the very second BTS miraculously exploded onto the massive, completely unforgiving Western stage, Namjoon was immediately and unfairly shoved into the impossibly difficult, immensely stressful role of the group's sole English-speaking mouthpiece, effectively transforming a young, deeply introspective, and highly sensitive underground rapper from Ilsan into an involuntary global diplomat, a cultural ambassador, and the definitive, impenetrable shield for his vulnerable members against an absolute onslaught of incredibly aggressive, incredibly intrusive Western media interviews that constantly sought to twist their words, mock their culture, and exploit their explosive, unprecedented fame for cheap clicks. For long, grueling years, he carried this crushing, monumental weight completely alone on his broad shoulders, rapidly translating complex, highly nuanced questions in his busy mind in real time, while simultaneously formulating incredibly safe, perfectly diplomatic answers to perfectly protect his younger bandmates from any potential, career-destroying scandals or cultural misunderstandings. A relentless, mentally exhausting tightrope walk that left him with severe, completely untreated mental burnout and a profound, hauntingly isolating sense of extreme loneliness that absolutely no amount of massive, record-breaking Billboard chart success or sold-out stadium tours could ever possibly cure or properly validate. But the true, horrifying breaking point, the utterly devastating and raw moment that truly shattered the collective hearts of millions of fiercely devoted armies across the entire globe, occurred during the notoriously emotional, deeply unfiltered 2022 Festa dinner, an incredibly heavy, tear-soaked broadcast where Namjoon, usually the unbreakable, stoic bedrock of the entire organization, completely broke down in agonizing, uncontrollable sobs as he heavily delivered the utterly shocking, completely unexpected news of their indefinite group hiatus, finally confessing to the entire watching world with a violently trembling voice that he felt entirely trapped, deeply exhausted to his absolute core, and utterly lost as a human being, stating with brutal, heartbreaking honesty that the relentless, non-stop, capitalistic machinery of the massive K-pop idol system had completely destroyed his fundamental ability to properly mature as a normal adult, leaving him feeling like a completely hollow, automated machine tirelessly churning out content rather than a living, breathing, passionate artist. He agonizingly admitted that he no longer knew who he truly was or what kind of crucial, meaningful message he even wanted to desperately convey to the world anymore. A deeply terrifying and paralyzing identity crisis that is the direct, tragic, and inevitable result of willingly sacrificing his entire youth, his personal privacy, and his own individual growth to tirelessly support, fiercely protect, and endlessly elevate the massive, towering, multi-billion-dollar brand of BTS over his own basic human needs. The incredibly heavy, jewel-encrusted crown of absolute leadership is not just a prestigious, shiny title for him. It has become a brutal, agonizing, and intensely lonely prison cell, demanding that he constantly, endlessly swallow his own deep-rooted fears, his suffocating, midnight anxieties, and his terrifying life uncertainties just to flawlessly maintain the grand, comforting illusion of absolute, unwavering stability for his 6 younger brothers who heavily rely on him, and for the millions of deeply devoted fans who constantly, eagerly look up to him for daily moral guidance and profound inspiration. The immense, truly unfathomable pressure of being universally and unfairly expected to speak absolutely perfectly on extremely complex, dangerously heavy real-world issues like global politics, rampant anti-Asian hate crimes, and massive social justice movements, all while simultaneously carrying the literal economic weight of the entire South Korean entertainment industry squarely on his incredibly tired, heavily burdened back, is a horrifyingly colossal, absolutely monstrous task that would easily, completely crush any normal, ordinary human being into literal dust without a second thought. In his profoundly, deeply personal, intensely introspective solo masterpiece album Indigo, and his later raw, incredibly vulnerable documentary releases, we were finally granted a deeply unsettling, heartbreakingly intimate, and almost uncomfortable glimpse into the immense, cavernous void of his extremely turbulent inner world, a quiet, desperate, and often agonizing daily struggle where he constantly, endlessly wanders through heavily silent, empty contemporary art museums and remote, lonely nature trails on his bicycle, desperately, frantically searching for tiny, fleeting fragments of the real, authentic, 20-something Kim Namjoon, desperately trying to salvage whatever microscopic, untainted pieces of his original, innocent soul are left completely untouched by the massive, blinding, all-consuming, and utterly terrifying global entity that is RM. He has openly, bravely discussed his intense, crippling struggles with severe, dark depression, his profound, terrifying feelings of being entirely unworthy of the massive, staggering, and sometimes suffocating love he constantly receives from the public, and his desperate, frantic, almost breathless yearning to just be a completely normal, anonymous guy who can simply walk down a quiet, sunlit street, grab a cheap cup of coffee, or visit a local bookstore without triggering a massive, highly dangerous mob of screaming fans or instantly sparking a frantic, viral global news cycle that completely obliterates his fundamental human right to basic safety and quiet privacy. As the massive, highly anticipated 2026 reunion season finally draws near, sending massive shockwaves of deep, passionate excitement and feverish anticipation through the massive global fandom, we desperately have to pause, take a deep, grounding breath, and critically look back at the agonizing, deeply painful psychological foundation this upcoming historic comeback is truly being built upon. Realizing with absolute, horrifying clarity that Namjoon is once again actively preparing to willingly step right back into that incredibly intense, completely unforgiving global pressure cooker, bravely and selflessly picking up that agonizingly heavy crown despite the profound, lingering, and incredibly deep psychological scars it has already viciously carved into his incredibly gentle, poetic soul. The incredibly dark, heavy, and unspoken fear that deeply haunts the quiet, restless midnight thoughts of the older, observant fans is the terrifying, chilling reality that he is continually, silently bleeding out his own life force for the sake of the team's massive, enduring historical legacy, constantly pushing aside his own desperate, urgent need for deep psychological healing just to violently ensure the group remains absolutely intact and completely legendary for the history books of tomorrow. We are violently forced to intensely, brutally question how much longer this incredibly brilliant, deeply sensitive poet can physically and mentally sustain this agonizing. Number 5. Suga, the silent agony of a broken body and mind. When Min Yoongi spits absolute fire into a microphone with his intense, aggressive rap style as August D, he is the literal embodiment of fierce, unapologetic rebellion, a terrifyingly sharp and fiercely protective artist who violently commands the stage with an intimidating, dark, and utterly intoxicating aura that immediately demands absolute silence and total respect from anyone lucky enough to witness it. Yet behind that incredibly tough, untouchable, and seemingly impenetrable exterior lies a deeply heartbreaking, agonizing, and terrifying history of severe physical torture and profound psychological darkness that he has miraculously, incredibly survived. Long before the private jets, the towering luxury penthouses, and the history-making, sold-out stadium tours, Yoongi was desperately, painfully fighting a literal, everyday war for simple, basic survival, working grueling, exhausting part-time jobs as a delivery boy on the busy, dangerous streets of Seoul just to afford a cheap bowl of noodles, while his deeply unsupportive family aggressively, painfully rejected his musical dreams, leaving him feeling utterly abandoned, incredibly angry, and dangerously isolated from the entire world. It was during one of these desperate, rain-soaked delivery runs that disaster violently struck, resulting in a horrific, completely devastating motorcycle accident that viciously shattered his shoulder, an incredibly agonizing, life-altering injury that he completely, silently hid from his agency for an unimaginably long time, absolutely terrified that they would instantly, ruthlessly kick him out of the highly competitive debut lineup if they found out he was physically broken, a truly heartbreaking decision that forced him to endure excruciating, blinding pain in total silence, while violently executing intense, bone-crushing daily dance practices that only made the severe injury significantly, permanently worse. For agonizing, endless years, even as BTS skyrocketed to unprecedented, dizzying heights of global fame, Yoongi silently, desperately suffered through absolute physical hell, heavily relying on incredibly strong painkillers and painful, frequent cortisone injections directly into his severely damaged joint just to temporarily numb the unbearable, searing agony enough to lift his arm during their physically demanding, highly energetic concerts, masterfully, flawlessly hiding his intense physical suffering behind a tough, stoic expression while his actual body was literally screaming in agonizing, relentless pain. The true, terrifying breaking point finally arrived in late 2020 when the sheer, unadulterated pain became so utterly paralyzing, so completely unbearable that he could no longer even physically hold a microphone or sleep through the night, violently forcing him to finally undergo a major, incredibly invasive surgery to forcefully repair his completely torn shoulder labrum, a massive, terrifying medical procedure that suddenly, abruptly pulled him away from the massive, blinding spotlight and forced him into an incredibly long, deeply frustrating, and incredibly painful period of intense physical rehabilitation that took a massive, heavy toll on his mental health. But the absolute most terrifying part of Yoongi's story isn't just the visible, physical scars that violently mark his body. It is the incredibly dark, intensely suffocating, and deeply terrifying psychological battles he has bravely, openly fought regarding his severe depression, crippling social anxiety, and his agonizing, terrifying struggles with intense OCD, dark, heavy demons he so vividly and courageously laid bare in his remarkably raw, incredibly aggressive debut mixtape. He is a man who has bravely, explicitly spoken out about his profound, terrifying fear of completely falling from grace, the massive, overwhelming, and deeply suffocating pressure of constantly producing hit after hit, and the incredibly dark, incredibly lonely periods where he felt completely and utterly consumed by the massive, terrifying shadow of his own unprecedented, astronomical success. Openly admitting that there were truly dark, terrifying times when he violently hated himself and deeply struggled to find any genuine reason to keep living when the massive, deafening applause suddenly stopped and the blinding lights finally faded to black. Even as he bravely embarks on his required military service, entirely removed from his beloved, chaotic musical sanctuaries and forcefully separated from the intense, deeply comforting brotherhood of his bandmates, we are desperately, frantically left to deeply wonder how his incredibly fragile, heavily scarred mind is currently coping with the sudden, jarring isolation and the massive, overwhelming burden of his own heavy, racing thoughts now that the constant, chaotic, and heavily distracting momentum of his idle career has been forcefully, abruptly brought to a complete, terrifying standstill. His intensely emotional, tears-soaked final concert before his enlistment, where he completely broke down sobbing while performing Snooze, was a truly devastating, incredibly raw display of a deeply vulnerable man who was physically and emotionally completely drained, desperately pouring out every single remaining drop of his soul for his beloved fans, yet simultaneously revealing a profound, deeply hidden fragility that instantly set off massive, blaring alarm bells of intense worry and deep concern throughout the entire global fandom. The incredibly dark, terrifyingly real prospect of him constantly, silently fighting these massive, internal demons completely alone in the rigid, unforgiving environment of the military is a chilling, horrifying thought that deeply haunts the quiet, midnight hours of those who truly understand the massive, overwhelming depths of his past mental health struggles, violently forcing us to intensely question if the immense, healing power of his music is truly enough to permanently save him from his own dark, intrusive thoughts. Is the tough, untouchable, genius producer we all deeply admire actually a profoundly wounded, incredibly fragile soul who has simply mastered the incredible, deeply painful art of transforming his own agonizing, bloody suffering into brilliant, chart-topping art, constantly reopening his own deep, psychological wounds just to provide a tiny bit of comforting medicine for the rest of the world? And if a man this incredibly brilliant, fiercely independent, and fiercely protective is secretly, desperately fighting a terrifying, lifelong war against his own broken body and his heavily scarred mind, what deeply shocking, entirely unimaginable, and profoundly devastating struggles are silently, quietly consuming the remaining members as the massive, unforgiving pressure of the entire entertainment industry continues to ruthlessly, unapologetically squeeze the very life out of them? What horrifying, entirely hidden, and deeply alarming secrets are patiently waiting to be forcefully uncovered in the very next shocking revelation, ready to completely overturn our entire understanding of their glittering reality and plunge us even deeper into the terrifying, agonizing, and deeply unsettling abyss of K-pop's absolute darkest, most hidden shadows. Number 4. Jungkook, the suffocating golden cage of the ultimate prodigy. When you look at Jungkook, the universally acclaimed, undeniably spectacular golden magne of the biggest musical act on the entire planet, you immediately see an absolute powerhouse of a performer, a mesmerizing, multi-talented prodigy who can flawlessly execute gravity-defying choreography, hit soaring, crystal-clear high notes, and completely command a massive, sold-out global stadium stage with an infuriatingly effortless charisma that leaves millions of fans completely breathless and begging for more. Yet beneath that fiercely confident, heavily tattooed exterior and that famously charming, bunny-like smile lies a deeply heartbreaking, profoundly agonizing reality of a young man who literally had to completely sacrifice his entire, innocent childhood on the unforgiving, relentless altar of massive global superstardom. Let us violently rewind the timeline back to the very beginning, to a deeply terrifying time when a tiny, incredibly shy, and completely overwhelmed 15-year-old boy from Busan with big, doe eyes and an impossibly huge dream was suddenly, abruptly thrust into the insanely brutal, highly competitive, and famously ruthless meat grinder of the South Korean idol training system, a fiercely punishing environment that violently stripped away his normal, carefree teenage years and forcefully replaced them with grueling, bone-crushing, 24-hour dance practices, extreme, sleep-deprived vocal lessons, and a suffocating, terrifying pressure to somehow flawlessly carry the immense, heavy hopes of a rapidly sinking, completely bankrupt entertainment company squarely on his incredibly young, fragile shoulders. He didn't get to experience the simple, mundane, but incredibly crucial joys of a normal adolescence. He didn't get to go to the movies with normal friends, heavily rebel against his parents, or simply figure out who he genuinely was as a completely normal human being, because he was essentially, fundamentally raised by 6 older, equally terrified teenagers in a cramped, intensely claustrophobic, and heavily damp single-room dorm, absorbing all of their massive, overwhelming anxieties, their dark, midnight fears, and their agonizing, tearful breakdowns as if they were his very own. This profound, deeply ingrained psychological trauma of entirely skipping a normal childhood has manifested in a terrifyingly heavy, incredibly suffocating burden of absolute perfectionism, a massive, unyielding pressure to constantly, endlessly live up to the impossible, godlike, golden title that the industry and the millions of adoring fans have forcefully bestowed upon him. Terrified that if he ever makes a single, microscopic mistake, if his voice ever cracks just once on a high note, or if he shows even a tiny, fleeting glimpse of normal human exhaustion, he will instantly, completely let down the 6 older brothers who practically raised him and the massive, million-strong global fandom that heavily relies on his blinding, flawless light. The incredibly dark, terrifyingly real consequence of this astronomical, unprecedented level of global fame is the complete, violent, and utterly heartbreaking obliteration of his basic human right to safety and personal privacy, an agonizing, terrifying reality that has plunged him into a deeply suffocating, entirely inescapable psychological prison where he cannot even simply order takeout food, visit a public gym, or step outside his heavily fortified, multi-million-dollar luxury apartment, without being aggressively, viciously stalked by dangerously obsessed, highly intrusive satiating fans who forcefully cross every single moral and legal boundary just to forcefully insert themselves into his intensely private life. We all vividly, painfully remember those incredibly late-night, deeply unsettling, and remarkably raw Weverse live broadcasts that he frequently held during his massive solo era and right before his military enlistment, those intensely intimate, deeply heartbreaking hours where a heavily intoxicated, profoundly lonely Jungkook would sit completely alone in his dimly lit living room, desperately, frantically reaching out to the digital void of the internet for a tiny, fleeting shred of genuine human connection, singing melancholic, tear-jerking ballads until he physically cried, openly begging the terrifying stalkers to stop sending unwanted, creepy deliveries to his private home address, and eventually, tragically falling completely asleep in front of millions of watching strangers, just so he wouldn't have to face the deafening, suffocating silence of his massive, empty house all by himself. During the intensely chaotic, immensely grueling global promotional tour for his record-breaking solo album, Golden, we actively saw a young man physically pushing himself way beyond the absolute, healthy limits of human endurance, fiercely battling through severe, agonizing colds and intense, crippling physical fatigue to deliver flawlessly executed, high-energy performances on international television, driven purely out of a deeply terrifying, completely paralyzing fear of disappointing the massive global audience that fiercely expects nothing less than absolute, divine perfection from him at all times. It was a profoundly devastating, incredibly alarming display of extreme, psychological isolation that instantly sent massive, blaring waves of deep, agonizing panic throughout the incredibly observant ARMY fandom, forcing us all to brutally, intensely confront the deeply uncomfortable, horrifying reality that the most famous, fiercely adored, and incredibly successful 20-something-year-old pop star on the face of the earth was secretly, silently battling a profound, paralyzing loneliness. That no amount of massive Billboard Hot 100 #1 hits, no collection of shiny Grammy nominations, and no astronomical, mind-boggling bank account balance could ever possibly cure or temporarily numb. And as we all rapidly, anxiously approach the heavily anticipated, history-making massive reunion of the entire group in the monumental year of 2026, the sheer, unadulterated, and terrifying psychological pressure currently mounting on his heavily tattooed shoulders is growing to an absolutely monstrous, completely unimaginable scale, because he is not just fiercely expected to flawlessly return from the incredibly rigid, intensely demanding, and deeply isolating environment of his mandatory military service, he is widely, ruthlessly expected to immediately, effortlessly pick right back up where he left off, to completely dominate the massive global music charts once again, and to single-handedly carry the explosive, fiercely demanding vocal choruses of the group's highly anticipated comeback tracks without missing a single, microscopic beat. Every single time he fiercely, passionately throws his entire physical body into a violently aggressive dance break. Every single time he dangerously pushes his vocal cords to their absolute, tearing limit to hit those iconic, crystal clear high notes. And every single time he flashes that perfectly practiced, devastatingly charming smile to the blinding barrage of thousands of flashing paparazzi cameras, he is violently, silently fighting a massive, terrifying internal war against his own deep-seated, crippling exhaustion, a deeply wounded inner child who is constantly, desperately crying out for just a tiny, peaceful moment of genuine, undisturbed rest in a brutal, unforgiving industry that fiercely demands 110% of his soul at every single waking second of the day. It aggressively, violently forces us to ask ourselves the most terrifying, deeply unsettling question of all. Is the spectacular, awe-inspiring, and seemingly invincible Golden Magne actually a deeply exhausted, profoundly lonely prisoner trapped completely inside a magnificent, heavily gilded, and impossibly shiny golden cage of our own massive, collective making, endlessly forced to perform breathtaking, gravity-defying tricks for our insatiable entertainment, while his own beautiful, deeply sensitive soul is quietly, agonizingly suffocating in the dark? And if the supposedly strongest, most physically gifted. Number 3. the agonizing isolation of the world's most handsome face. When you stare deeply into the impossibly intense, incredibly soulful eyes of Kim Tae-young, a man who is globally revered, universally worshipped, and officially crowned time and time again as the literal, undisputed most handsome face to ever physically grace the entire planet, you are instantly and completely captivated by an utterly mesmerizing, completely unearthly visual perfection that flawlessly, seamlessly masks a profoundly sensitive, beautifully complex, and intensely vulnerable old soul that has been repeatedly, viciously crushed under the massive, entirely unforgiving weight of unprecedented global scrutiny and impossible aesthetic expectations. From the very absolute beginning of BTS's incredibly turbulent, highly uncertain journey toward massive global superstardom, Taeyoung was forcefully, agonizingly subjected to a deeply terrifying, highly unique psychological torture that absolutely none of the other 6 members had to endure in the same horrifying way. He was strictly, coldly designated by the agency's completely ruthless management as the group's hidden member, literally forced to sit completely alone in absolute, agonizing silence in the dark, forgotten corners of the cramped recording studios and the heavily crowded, damp dorm rooms, strictly forbidden from participating in the group's early online vlogs or freely, openly interacting with the very first, crucial waves of curious fans, leaving an incredibly young, deeply terrified, and highly anxious teenage boy intensely plagued by the massive, suffocating, and deeply agonizing fear that he was entirely inadequate, horribly unwanted, and constantly on the terrifying, knife-edge verge of being abruptly, ruthlessly cut from the final debut lineup without a single, solitary word of warning or explanation. This deeply traumatic, intensely isolating early experience carved a massive, invisible, and incredibly deep psychological scar right into the very core of his incredibly gentle, highly artistic heart, a profound, deeply rooted, and intensely agonizing insecurity that fiercely dictated his incredibly desperate, almost frantic early attempts to forcefully mold his naturally eccentric, beautifully unique, and brilliantly artistic, free-flowing personality into a highly digestible, perfectly curated, and incredibly restrictive idol persona that the notoriously vicious, highly judgmental Korean general public would finally accept, understand, and deeply love. For incredibly long, deeply exhausting, and emotionally draining years, he was unfairly, ruthlessly, and highly offensively branded with the completely dehumanizing, incredibly reductive alien label by the mass media, and even by some of his very own, highly misguided fans, a deeply hurtful, heavily misunderstood caricature that violently stripped away his profound, complex artistic depth and completely reduced a deeply emotional, highly intelligent jazz enthusiast and incredibly gifted baritone vocalist to a completely one-dimensional, quirky, and odd comic relief character, a profoundly agonizing misrepresentation that he later bravely, heartbreakingly confessed on international television deeply wounded his fragile self-esteem and made him intensely, actively question his own fundamental worth as a genuine, highly complex human being. But the absolute most horrifying, truly devastating turning point in his entire life, the agonizing, incredibly heart-shattering, and utterly brutal moment that violently ripped the beautiful, innocent illusion of his glamorous idol life completely to shreds, occurred during the intensely chaotic, incredibly demanding, and fiercely competitive promotions of the monumental Blood, Sweat, and Tears era in late 2016, a highly critical, incredibly triumphant period for the group's rapidly exploding career that tragically, devastatingly, and almost cruelly coincided with the sudden, highly unexpected, an utterly heartbreaking death of his incredibly beloved grandmother, the incredibly warm, fiercely loving, an utterly foundational woman who had practically raised him entirely with her own two working hands for over 14 long years while his own parents were incredibly busy working backbreaking jobs far away just to survive. In a deeply terrifying, absolutely monstrous, and highly chilling display of the massive K-pop entertainment industry's completely unfeeling, highly sociopathic, and fiercely capitalistic machinery, Taeyong was ruthlessly, forcefully denied the absolute basic, fundamental human right to properly, quietly mourn the absolute most deeply important, incredibly foundational pillar of his entire personal life. Instead, he was violently shoved directly back out under the blinding, intensely hot, and entirely unforgiving stage lights, fiercely ordered to instantly plaster on a dazzling, perfectly charming, and utterly fake smile, and heavily forced to flawlessly perform highly energetic, intensely cheerful, and deeply complex choreography for tens of thousands of screaming, completely oblivious fans while his own heart was completely, violently shattering into a million jagged, bloody pieces entirely inside his chest, an incredibly horrific, deeply traumatizing, and intensely agonizing experience of absolute emotional suppression that ultimately culminated in a remarkably raw, deeply agonizing, and completely unscripted tearful breakdown during their massive Gocheok Sky Dome fan meeting that left the entire global fandom completely paralyzed with intense, overwhelming grief, absolute horror, and a profound sense of collective guilt. The immense, terrifying, and completely irreversible psychological damage violently inflicted by this profound, unspoken trauma severely compounded over the next several exhausting years, rapidly spiraling into a deeply suffocating, incredibly dark, and heavily paralyzing period of intense artistic burnout and severe, crippling depression that completely consumed his mind during the intense, highly isolating, and heavily silent lockdowns of the global pandemic, an incredibly dark, fiercely, terrifying emotional abyss that he bravely, beautifully, and agonizingly immortalized in the incredibly haunting, deeply melancholic, and entirely stripped-down lyrics of his self-produced masterpiece track, Blue and Gray. In this remarkably vulnerable, intensely heartbreaking, and deeply raw confession to the entire watching world, Taeyong explicitly, agonizingly revealed that he felt completely and utterly devoid of all fundamental human emotion, stating with brutal, terrifying honesty that the massive, blinding, heavily intoxicating, and entirely consuming global fame had violently transformed him into a completely hollow, intensely exhausted, and completely broken machine, desperately, frantically begging the cold, silent universe for a tiny, fleeting shred of genuine human warmth or a single, quiet, undisturbed moment of absolute peace from the incredibly massive, heavily suffocating, and constantly demanding shadow of the fiercely critical global entity known universally as V. The sheer unadulterated terror of his intensely heavily scrutinized, deeply invaded, and completely unprotected daily existence is constantly, violently magnified by the horrifying, deeply unsettling, and dangerously aggressive massive mobs of intensely obsessed, highly delusional saseing stalker fans who constantly, violently ambush him at major international airports, aggressively, physically shoving massive, blindingly flashing camera lenses mere inches from his visibly terrified, heavily distressed, and completely exhausted face, completely ignoring his desperate, frantic pleas for basic personal space, and violently transforming what should be a completely normal, completely safe travel experience into an incredibly traumatic, highly dangerous, and fiercely chaotic physical fight for simple survival. An intense, horrifying, and deeply triggering reality that constantly ignites his severe, heavily documented social anxieties and leaves him deeply, intensely fearful of the very. Number 2. J-Hope, the crushing burden of the eternal sunshine. When you hear the overwhelmingly loud, iconic, and fiercely joyful introduction of "I'm your hope, you're my hope, I'm J-Hope," instantly echo through the massive, sold-out stadium speakers, you are immediately, completely blinded by the seemingly invincible, radiant, and intensely contagious energy of Jungkook, a remarkably charismatic, terrifyingly flawless main dancer and highly explosive rapper who has been universally, stubbornly painted by the media and the massive global fandom as the literal, absolute sunshine of the entire group, yet hidden deeply, agonizingly beneath that famously bright, heart-shaped smile and that impossibly high-spirited, boisterous exterior is a profoundly heavy, intensely suffocating, and incredibly dark psychological reality that he has masterfully, painfully concealed from the entire world for over an agonizingly long decade. From the very exact moment he bravely, faithfully adopted that incredibly heavy, highly expectant stage name, he unwittingly, violently locked himself entirely inside an impossibly demanding, completely unforgiving emotional prison, fundamentally forcing his incredibly complex, profoundly human, and often deeply exhausted authentic self into a perfectly curated, rigidly mandated, and entirely unnatural state of absolute, constant positivity that completely ignores his fundamental human right to simply feel sad, entirely angry, or profoundly tired. The sheer unadulterated terror of his intensely demanding position within the group is massively, terrifyingly amplified by his crucial, highly stressful role as the official choreography leader, an incredibly daunting, incredibly heavy responsibility where the famously strict, eagle-eyed team leader Jung is intensely, fiercely relied upon to single-handedly maintain the breathtaking, fiercely legendary, and absolutely microscopic synchronization of 7 incredibly diverse bodies. A deeply grueling, heavily exhausting mental and physical burden that constantly, violently forces him to push his own severely overworked muscles, his severely aching joints, and his intensely exhausted mind way past the absolute, dangerous brink of literal human endurance just to violently ensure that BTS never, ever loses their monumental, industry-defining reputation for absolute stage perfection. We completely, conveniently forget that before the private jets, the massively historic Billboard sweeps, and the incredibly shiny Grammy stages, Hoseok was a fiercely ambitious, deeply passionate underground street dancer in Gwangju, who violently tore his own body apart on incredibly hard, unforgiving concrete floors, completely sacrificing his own fundamental physical health to painfully, desperately crawl his way up into the notoriously ruthless, highly cutthroat Seoul entertainment industry, carrying the massive, incredibly heavy weight of his family's deep financial struggles squarely on his incredibly young, completely terrified shoulders. This profound, deeply ingrained habit of extreme, highly dangerous physical self-sacrifice has violently, completely carried over into his massively global idol career, where he silently, painfully endures agonizing, deeply terrifying muscle spasms, severely chronic back pain, and incredibly intense physical exhaustion entirely behind closed doors, perfectly, seamlessly slapping on a massive, dazzlingly bright smile the exact millisecond the aggressive red light of the broadcasting camera violently flashes on, fiercely terrified that showing even a single, fleeting micro-expression of intense physical agony will instantly, completely destroy the precious, highly comforting illusion of the eternal sunshine that millions of intensely devoted fans completely, heavily rely on for their own daily mental survival. The true, incredibly horrifying, An entirely heartbreaking magnitude of his deeply hidden internal darkness was finally, violently unleashed upon the entire world during the incredibly raw, conceptually heavy, and fiercely aggressive rollout of his monumental solo debut album, Jack in the Box. A profoundly dark, intensely shocking, and completely unexpected masterpiece where he deliberately, violently set the entirely fake, deeply suffocating J-Hope persona entirely on fire, explicitly, agonizingly confessing through incredibly heavy, grunge-inspired rap tracks like Arson, that his massive, unyielding passion had completely, violently burned him alive from the inside out, completely leaving him heavily stranded in a massive, terrifying void of intense psychological emptiness, deeply profound isolation, and a horrifying, intensely paralyzing fear of what remains of his genuine soul when the massive, blinding stage lights are finally, permanently turned off. In remarkably brave, intensely vulnerable documentary footage and heavily emotional interviews during that deeply cathartic era, Hoziak explicitly, openly admitted to the entire watching world that he often feels incredibly hollow, completely drained, and deeply depressed when he returns to his intensely quiet, massively empty luxury apartment completely alone, profoundly struggling to reconcile the incredibly massive, completely god-like global superstar entity that the world intensely worships with the incredibly tired, deeply anxious, and fundamentally simple human being named Jung Hoziak, who is desperately, frantically crying out for a single, quiet moment of genuine, undisturbed rest without the intensely heavy, incredibly suffocating burden of having to be everybody else's personal therapist, emotional anchor, and constant source of unwavering light. As he bravely, silently completes his incredibly grueling, highly disciplined, and intensely demanding mandatory military service, fiercely serving as an incredibly strict assistant drill instructor far away from the massive, glittering stages and the intensely comforting brotherhood of his beloved group, we absolutely must painfully, intensely confront the horrifying, deeply unsettling, and entirely uncomfortable reality that the intensely agonizing, fiercely high-stakes pressure of the massively anticipated 2026 global group reunion is already, violently starting to painfully mount squarely on his already heavily burdened, physically exhausted shoulders, fiercely demanding that he eventually, inevitably returns to flawlessly, effortlessly lead the absolute most intensely demanding, physically grueling, and completely flawless choreography the highly competitive K-pop industry has ever physically witnessed, entirely ignoring the incredibly massive, deeply profound, psychological toll it has already violently taken on his incredibly fragile, beautifully complex mind. Every single time he violently, fiercely contorts his incredibly agile body into an impossibly dangerous, intensely complex dance move, and every single time he loudly, forcefully projects that incredibly bright, famously reassuring laughter into a deafeningly loud microphone to violently mask the agonizing, heavily silent screams of his own intense, crippling mental exhaustion, he is violently, silently sacrificing his own fundamental inner peace, his completely normal psychological well-being, and his own precious physical health entirely on the massive, intensely unforgiving altar of an incredibly demanding, entirely sociopathic global entertainment machine that fiercely, ruthlessly devours the youth, the sanity, and the very souls of its absolute greatest, most beautifully talented stars. It intensely, violently forces every single one of us to deeply, philosophically, and painfully ask ourselves the absolute most terrifying, intensely haunting question. If the literal, supposedly unbreakable emotional bedrock, the absolute brightest, most incredibly reassuring sunshine of the entire massive group is secretly, desperately violently drowning in such an incredibly dark, immensely suffocating, and terrifyingly silent ocean of intense psychological burnout and deep emotional. Number 1. Jeon, the devastating sacrifice of the smiling eldest. When you witness the universally recognized, utterly breathtaking, and famously confident introduction of Kim Seokjin, a man who effortlessly, loudly declares himself as worldwide handsome, while blowing his iconic, incredibly charming flying kisses to the deafeningly loud, sold-out stadium crowds, you are immediately, completely mesmerized by a seemingly unbreakable, fiercely joyful, and hilariously chaotic pillar of absolute light, yet hidden entirely beneath that famously contagious windshield wiper laughter and those perfectly timed, highly entertaining dad jokes is the profoundly agonizing, intensely heartbreaking, and heavily completely concealed reality of a deeply insecure, profoundly exhausted man who literally, willingly sacrificed his entire personal dignity, his deep artistic pride, and his own fragile mental sanity, just to violently, desperately keep his 6 beloved younger brothers entirely safe from the massive, completely unforgiving meat grinder of the global entertainment industry. We absolutely must violently rewind the clock to the profoundly terrifying, highly uncertain early debut days, to deeply, painfully understand that unlike the other members who were fiercely passionate, highly experienced musical prodigies, Seokjin was merely a young, completely untrained, and entirely innocent college acting major who was literally pulled off the streets entirely because of his remarkably stunning, completely unearthly physical visuals, abruptly, violently thrown into a cramped, incredibly damp, and highly suffocating practice room alongside terrifyingly talented underground rap battle champions and fierce, internationally recognized street dancers. The sheer, unadulterated, and completely paralyzing terror he constantly, silently endured in those early years is absolutely unimaginable. He was forcefully, cruelly positioned as the group's visual whole, in terms of talent by the notoriously vicious, highly judgmental early K-pop critics, a deeply humiliating, completely agonizing narrative that violently forced him to spend countless, entirely sleepless nights completely alone in the freezing, dark practice studios, violently forcing his incredibly stiff, completely untrained body to memorize insanely complex, physically punishing hip-hop choreography until his joints literally bled, his muscles severely, painfully tore, and he physically collapsed in pools of his own desperate, agonizing sweat and silent tears, just so he wouldn't be a massive, heavy burden to the younger kids he so fiercely loved. But the absolute most beautifully tragic, deeply heartbreaking, and entirely unfathomable sacrifice he made wasn't just physical. It was deeply, profoundly psychological, because in the highly rigid, fiercely strict, and deeply traditional hierarchical culture of South Korea, the absolute eldest brother, the Hyung, is culturally mandated to hold immense, completely unquestionable authority and demand absolute, silent respect from the younger members. Yet Seokjin actively, consciously, and completely deliberately threw that massive cultural privilege entirely out the window, willingly, repeatedly lowering himself to play the absolute fool, the loud, heavily exaggerated, and entirely chaotic comedic relief character, just to violently shatter the intensely suffocating, completely paralyzing tension that constantly threatened to crush the highly sensitive, deeply anxious younger members under the astronomical, utterly monstrous pressures of their skyrocketing global fame. He absorbed every single ounce of their massive, dark anxieties, fiercely offering his famous, incredibly broad shoulders as a literal and metaphorical resting place, perfectly, flawlessly masking his own immense, agonizing internal bleeding and profound feelings of severe inadequacy behind a completely bulletproof, titanium-grade mask of absolute, unwavering confidence that left the entire watching world completely oblivious to the intense, violent internal war raging entirely within his gentle mind. The true, incredibly horrifying, and entirely heartbreaking magnitude of his intensely guarded inner darkness was finally, agonizingly revealed to the world through his deeply profound, incredibly devastating solo masterpiece track, Awake, where he remarkably, bravely, and explicitly confessed to the entire global fandom that he genuinely, deeply believed he would never, ever be as naturally gifted, as effortlessly brilliant, or as capable of flying as high as the other 6 beautiful petals of BTS, a violently raw, incredibly self-deprecating confession that violently tore his own fragile self-esteem to absolute shreds and left millions of deeply observant armies completely paralyzed with intense, overwhelming grief. And when the group astonishingly, miraculously achieved the absolute impossible, violently breaking every conceivable historical record by hitting the massive, highly coveted #1 spot on the Billboard Hot 100 with Dynamite, a monumental moment that should have been the absolute happiest day of his entire life, Jeon instead completely shocked the entire world by releasing Abyss, entirely out of nowhere, a profoundly dark, deeply melancholic, and terrifyingly raw musical letterware. He explicitly, bravely admitted to suffering from severe, entirely crippling psychological burnout and deeply profound depression, heavily confessing that the massive, blinding success made him feel incredibly hollow, entirely undeserving, and profoundly like an absolute, complete fraud who was constantly, desperately hiding his deep inner ruins completely behind the massive, towering, multi-billion-dollar brand of BTS. As the absolute first member to bravely, silently march directly into the freezing, intensely unforgiving, and completely isolated environment of the mandatory frontline military service, he once again selflessly, fiercely took the massive, terrifying brunt of the harsh, highly invasive public scrutiny entirely upon himself, violently shielding the 6 younger members from the massive, completely suffocating media circus and bravely paving the dark, highly uncertain path entirely alone. And now, as we frantically, passionately stand completely on the very edge of the highly anticipated, completely historic, and intensely momentous 2026 full group reunion, an incredibly massive, industry-defining event that is currently sending incredibly massive shockwaves of deep, passionate excitement completely across the entire globe, the sheer, unadulterated, and entirely unimaginable psychological weight currently resting squarely on his returning shoulders is absolutely, terrifyingly monstrous, as the entire world intensely, heavily expects him to immediately, flawlessly anchor the entire group once again, to effortlessly revive the chaotic, perfectly comforting joyful energy, and to perfectly, seamlessly mask the profound, invisible, and heavily agonizing scars of military isolation and immense time away from his beloved art. Every single time he bravely, fiercely steps back out into that massive, blindingly bright, and completely unforgiving stadium spotlight, aggressively flashing that famously breathtaking, highly reassuring smile and flawlessly, effortlessly belting out those incredibly high, deeply stable, and profoundly emotional vocal notes, he is violently, silently fighting an entirely massive, utterly terrifying internal war against his own deeply rooted, severely crippling imposter syndrome and profound physical exhaustion, desperately trying to perfectly maintain the grand, glittering illusion of the unbreakable, completely perfect eldest brother for an incredibly ravenous global entertainment machine that fiercely demands absolute, flawless perfection at all times.